Hi, I'm Amber Sherwood K, and I'm here today to talk about ethics in science communication. I'm the organizer of Kitsap County Skeptics and Kitsap Atheists and Agnostics in Kitsap County, Washington, and I'm also a science educator and communicator. I'd like to talk to you today about ethics in science communication and how the things that I've learned about science communication can inform us as atheists to disseminate our ideas better to the general public. Scientists are generally not trusted by the public, and neither are atheists, polling suggests. So we want to know why that is, what we can do to change it, and how that makes us more successful as a community in integrating ourselves in the public. And the question is, how can we present ourselves as a more ethical, trustworthy community by holding ourselves to higher standards? Why don't people trust atheists? Well, let's start by asking why people don't trust scientists. They actually have good reason. Early scientists were focused on discovery and not ethics, and things like the Tuskegee Airmen experiment, the Guatemalan prison experiment, Dr. Mengele, involuntary commitment of psychiatric patients, and even recent ethical breaches in animal research and Guantanamo Bay, where psychologists actually directed waterboarding and other forms of torture, we can see that the public does have a reason to distrust scientists. But science as a discipline has come a long way in the last 70 years. Scientists are now required to take ethics training, and institutional review boards check off all experimentation before it's done. We want to ask why scientists need ethics training, and Dr. David Resnick, a bioethicist, has done a really good job of distilling down our goals. First, we want to promote our research aims, which of course in science are knowledge and truth. We want to avoid fabrication, falsification, or misrepresentation of data. We want to be accountable to the public. The public funds most science research through either public funding or private corporate consumerism, and so we want the public to support science. And also we want to promote moral and social values. So this leads us to communicating science, and why is it necessary for science communicators to be ethical? And the reason is that a science communicator is actually a translator. We want to make sure that science communicators are translating the work of scientists accurately in a language that the lay public can understand. So if you trust a science communicator to tell you what's going on in science, then your scientists themselves become more accessible and more trustworthy. So why don't people trust science communicators? Well, there's a good reason for this. Journalism has always been pretty sensationalistic. Nowadays, we're looking for internet clicks, probably more than we're looking for actual content. We've always gone for the sexy headline. We've always overpromised the ramifications of research. You always hear in 5 years. Well, it's never in 5 years. So science journalism is prone to grabbing preliminary research and running with it. And that's not a really good idea. We've seen this in the many, many different communications of what kind of diet you should be on over the last 20 years. TV, websites, memes, Facebook pages, and groups have fallen into the trap of sensationalizing stories and printing inaccurate headlines to get eyes on clicks. With the advent of social media, anyone can be a science communicator. We have Facebook pages, we have Facebook groups, we have internet forums. Anyone can disseminate scientific information, whether or not they know what they're talking about. The internet has been a great equalizer. We can inform ourselves and pass on our knowledge in our own language to people that may not understand a scientist. I started communicating science about 5 years ago, mostly on the topic of genetically modified organisms. I moderated and was members of Facebook groups and forums, done public speaking, science writing. It's been a great experience. Early on, genetically modified organisms pretty much flew under everybody's radar. They've been used since 1996. It wasn't until the early 2000s that people started to notice that they were around, even though they were in the news quite a bit. The reason for that is that the organic food industry started growing, and rather than being a small niche market, now we're looking for higher market share. Unfortunately, organic produce is very expensive to produce. So in order to sell your product at a higher price, when science says it's really no better for you than a conventional produce, one of the things the organic industry started to do was disseminate false information about genetically modified organisms in order to increase their market share. Basically, they're using fear to sell their product. As a science advocate, I started informing the public on genetically modified organisms and the research done on them to kind of quell these fears that the organic industry was bringing up. I know, having studied the research, that all of the best data shows that they're safe and better for the environment than conventional or organic produce. At this point, there were very few science communicators out there talking about genetically modified organisms, mostly scientists, and most of them not trained in science communication. We were probably unsophisticated, we were probably too technical, and we didn't really have a really great idea of how to communicate. We were in the minority, but we were passionate, and we worked really hard to get people to understand that genetically modified organisms really are safe, and it's a great technology that we can use far into the future. We were fairly successful. Acceptance has increased quite a bit in the last 5 years as people have gotten more comfortable with the technology and seen what it can do, not just for crops, but for medicine and other areas. As acceptance has increased, there's been an increase of the number of people in social media that are pro-science activists who really have very little knowledge of the subject and very little knowledge of good communication tactics. A lot of people have joined the movement and are getting a bigger presence using techniques that we have always decried as science communicators, such as bullying, condescension, and doxing. These are negative behaviors that have been problematic to us in the past, but have primarily been used by anti-science zealots against us. It's been very disappointing to see these techniques used by people on my own side. 2 years ago, Scientific American ended their comments policy in their online magazine because they saw that the negativity in the comments was actually detracting from the communication of the science. In other words, people were taking sides rather than assessing the science itself. This is a great policy for a popular science magazine, but of course it can't be used in social media. Politicizing science has never been a great idea, but it's always been a problem. And the biggest problem, of course, that we've seen is in global warming. The consensus on global warming is that it is happening and it's exacerbated by human activity. But of course, we have a lot of moneyed interests, such as the oil companies, that would prefer that we didn't stop burning fossil fuels. So they've spent a lot of money trying to muddy the science. In one case, you may remember the University of East Anglia had their email server hacked and their emails were stolen. When the emails were published, it looked as though the scientists at East Anglia were actually changing data to fit their theory. The reality was they were just frustrated with non-scientists trying to tell them how to do their jobs. An investigation showed that there was no wrongdoing, but the damage was really done. Recently, a similar situation happened in the anti-GMO movement. A FOIA request was put in by an organic food group for Dr. Kevin Folta's emails. He is a professor of horticulture at the University of Florida, and as a state employee, his emails are subject to the Freedom of Information Act. Dr. Folta is a science communicator as well as a scientist, and he travels the country talking about the advantages of biotech and trying to recruit students into science. One of the tactics of the anti-GMO movement is the shill gambit. Basically what it says is, if you're pro-GMO, someone is paying you to say so. Now, of course, on the anti-side, this is actually true. Anti-GMO activists like Jeffrey Smith, Vandana Shiva, and the Food Babe are paid a lot of money to say what they say against GMOs, even though none of them are scientists. Some researchers, like Charles Benbrook, are actually paid to do research for the organic industry and don't disclose the conflict of interest when they publish. However, most scientists are careful to avoid conflict of interest, so their work is taken seriously. Dr. Folta has always disclosed his relationship with the biotech industry and has been a pro-science, pro-biotech advocate for years on his own dime. He's always insisted truthfully that neither Monsanto or any other biotech company pays him for his outreach. To challenge this narrative, Dr. Folta's emails were combed through, and anything that was seen to be a conflict of interest was brought out. As with East Anglia, innocuous emails just talking about the science were put forth as proof that Dr. Folta was working for the industry. A $25,000 grant that Dr. Folta's department received from Monsanto was recast as payment for services rendered, though of course this was not the case.
It kind of goes without saying that as a professor of horticulture, Dr. Folta is genuinely interested in the advancement of science. It's a difficult concept to grasp for those who actually believe that GMOs are dangerous to the environment or poisonous to humans.
Though defended strongly by science communicators and lay people on Facebook and elsewhere, Dr. Folta was the subject of a hit piece in the New York Times that really cast him in an unfavorable light and made it look as though he were being paid to play. Dr. Folta was the subject of harassment, nasty memes, threats, and thousands of phone calls and letters to his horticulture department, which eventually ended up in his resignation yesterday from science communication. He's going back to just leading his lab and his students, and I can't blame him. So how did this happen? The problem that I see is that though we started out receptive to people's fears about GMOs, we ended up taking the low road. People who didn't trust GMOs were cast as anti-science idiots or scientifically illiterate, and people who are pro-GMO were cast as shill or people who are conspiring with the government or corporations. It was just basically a mess. So what can we learn from this? Well, we can learn that science communicators should not get down in the gutter with their opponents, first of all. We want atheists to be as trusted as we want scientists to be in our community. So one way of doing that is to present and maintain high ethical standards of communication. Unlike most anti-science activists, who are generally anti-corporate, anti-government, or a combination of the two, atheists are opposed by theists or believers. Believers are different than anti-science zealots in that they're not really believing in a conspiracy, but this is an actual way of life to them, and they believe we are taking it away or trying to take it away. Here in Kitsap County, we have Joe Kennedy, the high school football coach who was caught praying on the field after games. Well, he's actually been doing it for about a decade. And as a substitute teacher, I know that Christianity is rampant in the schools, and it never goes away until someone complains. Well, what happened was someone actually complimented Joe Kennedy on praying on the field after the games, and the school looked into it, realized it was happening, and that they were open for a lawsuit. So they asked him to stop. Coach Kennedy eventually agreed to stop praying on the field, and he did, until social media got involved. First locally, then nationally, and then on Fox News. Coach Kennedy originally went to the American Center for Law and Justice to ask for help, but they refused because they knew that they would lose the case. But then the Liberty Institute got involved. So where do we stand now? Well, we stand in about the same place that we did with Kevin Folta and the anti-GMO movement. We have on one side a group of people who believe that they're right, and on the other side a group of people who believe that they're right, and how do we get them to come together without and not have this be the tragedy that it was with Dr. Folta? We can learn from the mistakes made by science advocates in the case of Dr. Folta when dealing with Dr. Kennedy and his followers. We can focus on the coercive nature of prayer to non-Christian students. We can demand high ethical standards from our educators, and we can be receptive and listen to our opponents' arguments and speak to them in a language they understand. We can do this by utilizing former Christians who can translate for us the language of the believer and communicate without anger. We cannot do hit pieces. There's no reason to trash Coach Kennedy. Let's just talk about what he's doing and why it's wrong. We don't have to make opponents into enemies. We can make them into allies by stressing that religious freedom for all is our goal. Recent polling has suggested that atheism is on the rise in the U.S., and the more people that we have that are non-believers, the more non-believers people will know. We don't have to be strangers. Just like the LGBT community was able to call on the fact that everybody knows someone in that community, we can also begin to call on the fact that everybody knows an atheist. They just might not know it yet. So our goal should be to gain public trust, high moral standards, and to take the opportunity to educate instead of battle the people on the other side. I invite you to join the Receptive Skepticism group on Facebook. This is a group where we're exploring science-based methods of communication which are receptive and non-confrontational to facilitate greater understanding among people of disparate groups. Thank you so much for joining me. You can follow me on Twitter at Sherwood K and look for my work at the Genetic Literacy Project.